My name is Eleanor West, and I'm a policy analyst in the division of the OECD that works on cities, urban policies, and sustainable development. And you an overview of the OECD work program on a territorial approach to climate action and resilience, or TACA, as we like to call it for short. It's a bit of a mouthful. And I hope that you'll find this useful for guiding your important work on measures to address climate change at the local level. So the OECD launched this work program in 2021 in response to growing recognition that one-size-fits-all sectoral climate policies are not going to be enough to meet commitments under the Paris Agreement. So the reality is that different places have different emissions profiles and different vulnerabilities to climate risks and impacts. Cities and regions are diverse in terms of geographical, climate, and environmental conditions, but also in terms of capacities and opportunities. So I've prepared a couple of slides to illustrate this diversity. So we know that cities in particular are responsible for about 70% of global emissions. And this chart shows the emissions per capita of the largest cities across the OECD, broken down by sector. And as you can see, there is wide variation between different cities. The urban agglomeration in the Ruhr Valley of Germany produces many times as many emissions as Bogota in Colombia, which you can see on the right-hand side there. If we're going to achieve the 2050 commitments set under the Paris Agreement, then cities in advanced economies need to be targeting around 4.7 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per capita by 2030, which is the red line on the figure there. And almost 40% of major cities in the OECD already achieved this target in 2022, which is promising, but there are still significant ways to go. Different places also have different vulnerabilities to climate hazards and risks. Cities are uniquely vulnerable because of high population densities and concentrations of critical infrastructure. Heat waves, for example, are usually more severe in cities due to the urban heat island effect, and this is caused by having lots of concrete and very little greenery. So on this slide, you can see that the vulnerability to the urban heat island effect differs significantly between different cities, depending on their context. Something else I think is important to keep in mind is that cities have highly complex and interdependent environmental, social, and economic systems, which means that climate shocks also tend to cascade and compound. So to give you an example, damage to buildings and infrastructure during severe storm events can trigger disruptions to transport, energy, water supply, food availability, and this can result in impacts that are more widespread than the initial impact. So this diversity of experiences between different places means that we need place-based solutions that acknowledge these differences and are tailored to local contexts. So this is why the OECD wants to support policymakers to develop a territorial approach to climate action and resilience. We published our flagship report in 2023, which introduces a framework to guide and support policymakers at all levels of government. So this framework, you can see on the right-hand side here, it has two main pillars. We want to encourage governments at all levels to adopt a place-based approach when designing climate policies. And then at the same time, we want to make sure that climate action and resilience is fully integrated into urban and regional development policies, so not treated in silos. Our framework offers several tools to policymakers. So we've put together a suite of 45 territorial climate indicators, which can be used to monitor the current state of action and resilience. We've also got 9 recommended actions, which you can use to assess existing policies. And we've also gathered together a compendium of leading practices from across the OECD. And I can talk about each of these tools in a little more detail shortly. But just to give you a bit more background, I know the interest of your gathering here today is in the role of local governments, and local governments do have a very important role to play. So we know that national governments are not going to be able to achieve their international commitments without the support of local governments. You all hold far too many of the critical levers that we need to pull. So, for example, cutting transport emissions in cities is going to require denser urban development and significant investment in public and active transport to reduce reliance on cars. And this isn't going to happen without the action of city governments. They need to change land use plans and make the necessary infrastructure investments. So, in our view, a territorial approach can help harness this untapped potential of local governments. From our perspective, local governments are uniquely well positioned to pursue integrated cross-sectoral policies and projects, as your competency is cut across so many different domains. You are the level of government that is close to the people and has the local knowledge needed to design interventions that are tailored to the local context. There are, of course, challenges to this approach that will need to be overcome. Sectoral policies, where climate change is addressed in silos, tends to be the norm at the national level in a lot of countries, and this is a culture that's going to need to change. There are also significant data gaps at the local level, which makes it difficult to design tailored interventions. Local governments tend to have a lot of competing priorities. They need to feel empowered to prioritize climate policies, and this is where direction from the national level can come in. And they also need the capacity and funding to actually implement their climate policies. So we designed our TACA framework to help policymakers overcome these barriers. So the first tool is our suite of 45 territorial climate indicators. We've compiled data for these indicators across all OECD countries at several different scales. So these indicators can be used to benchmark the current state of climate action and resilience in your city, in your region, in your country, in comparison to other regions, cities, and countries. So many of our climate indicators are available in the OECD local data portal, which you can access online. We have a specific section of the data portal called the Climate Monitor, which if I put the QR code there, but also if you just Google OECD local data portal, you should find your way to it, and you can scroll through these different indicators we have available and at which different scales they're available as well. Our second tool is our 9 action areas, which fall under 3 different pillars. These can be used as a checklist of sorts to assess the current policy landscape and help identify challenges and opportunities. So just to dive in a little more detail into these actions. So under the first pillar, which is integrating place-based policy into climate policy. So we have 3 actions in this area: measuring and monitoring greenhouse gas emissions, incorporating climate action into national plans, and developing subnational climate goals. So a couple of examples that you can read more about in our report. Japan has a Council for National and Local Decarbonization, which supports local governments to set realistic climate targets that are aligned with the national framework. And Canada has dedicated a section of its NDC to actions by provinces and territories. Even though an NDC is a national policy, they're acknowledging the important role of local governments. Pillar 2 is climate proofing regional policy at all territorial levels. So this is urban, rural, and regional development policies. And we have 3 actions under this pillar: mainstreaming climate into national development policies, promoting action at the right territorial scale, and supporting neighbourhood projects. So another couple of examples. Metro Vancouver in Canada promotes transit-oriented development at the metropolitan scale by working across administrative boundaries to make strategic planning choices to develop the city in a way that will reduce reliance on private vehicles. And Costa Rica's national urban development policy also incorporates climate objectives. So they've mainstreamed climate into their national development policy. And then the third pillar is enabling and scaling up local climate action and resilience. So under this pillar, we're looking to engage local actors and build partnerships, enhance funding and financing mechanisms, and create legal and institutional frameworks that support climate action at the local level. So as an example of a legal and institutional framework, Mexico has passed a general law on climate change that requires municipalities to reduce emissions, and in doing so, produce plans to support that action. And then in terms of funding and financing mechanisms, several regions in France have already implemented green budgeting practices to help support climate-friendly investment decisions. And then the final tool in our toolkit is our compendium of leading practices. And we've gathered these from across the OECD and beyond the OECD, actually. And these are also available in our report, and I've included a QR code for you. And these are intended to inspire action from policymakers seeking to take a territorial approach. So since publishing this framework in 2023, our work program has started focusing on supporting policymakers to apply it. So earlier this year, we published our first two tikā scans. So at the national level, looking at Japan, and at the local level, looking at the city of Yokohama within Japan. And these papers are both available on our website. So a tikā scan, as we call it, has three components. The first is that we use the suite of climate indicators to analyze or benchmark the current state with international and internal comparison between different places. And then the second component is using the checklist of 9 action areas to assess existing policies and identify challenges and future opportunities. And then from that, we produce recommendations tailored to that locality, to the country, or to the city. And these also, we do extra research to draw on international leading practices to inform their approach. Just to give an example of some of the analysis that we conducted for these two scans, we looked at greenhouse gas emissions in different prefectures in Japan, and found that greenhouse gas emissions have fallen in most of the urban areas since 1990, but they're continuing to rise in many rural areas. We also looked at the difference between built-up surface growth and population growth between 2000 and 2020, and found that most built-up areas have been, or actually all built-up areas have been growing faster than the population in every single city in Japan, which is indicative of urban sprawl, despite Japan having a reputation for quite high-density mixed-use cities. And then our scan of Yokohama within Japan, which is Japan's second largest city, I believe, near Tokyo. And we found that greenhouse gas emissions in Yokohama are already relatively low compared to other large metropolitan areas in the OECD. We also looked at green area coverage in Yokohama, which is important for climate resilience. Green areas help with the absorption and retention of rainwater, for instance, during storm events. They're also very important for alleviating the urban heat island effect. And we found that Yokohama has less green area coverage than other cities in the OECD, although it has quite high green area coverage compared to other cities within Japan. So we're currently in the process of selecting our next case studies. We, of course, welcome interest from policymakers who think a tikā scan would be useful to support their own work within their jurisdiction. Please feel free to get in touch if that's you. And I will finish there, and hopefully there's time to take questions.
Šis ir tas brīdis, kad tos var uzdot. Mums ir mikrofons zālē. Ja kāds vēlas ko jautāt, tad paceliet varbūt roku. Tāpat, protams, arī gaidīsim iesūtītos jautājumus, izmantojot mentu iespēju. Tad, starp citu, šeit otrā pusē arī ir tas QR kodiņš, ko noskanējot arī var sasniegt to iespēju, lai varētu uzdot arī jautājumus Eleonorai un citiem runātājiem šajā dienā. So, Eleanor, as you showed us, the TACAR framework includes 45 indicators across mitigation, adaptation, and actions. So for a city leader who is overwhelmed and under-resourced, what would be like the first steps? Maybe are there 2 or 3 priority indicators from the framework that you would recommend?
That's an interesting question. I think that one of the important things about climate action is that it really needs to be integrated. And I know it's overwhelming to look at many different aspects all at the same time. But I think you'll find if you have a look in our local data portal in the Climate Monitor, we have all of these indicators available. They're available for your municipalities as well. I checked this morning. And so you can quickly flick through the different indicators and see how your locality performs in comparison to others. We also have on our website, the TACAR report is quite long, but we've produced a policy highlights version of this report, which you can find on our website. And it includes a table that gives an overview of the different indicators we have available and at what scale and in which instances you might like to use them. So I would start by looking at that policy highlights.